Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy. Hermit, when you look at something, what can you see?
I can see that thing. I can see certain qualities of that thing, like its shape, size, color, maybe its use, what condition it's in, and etc. Why?
When the Buddha looks at a thing, he can see the 10 suchnesses of that thing without even trying. He can see its appearance, nature, entity, power, influence, internal cause, relation, latent effect, manifest effect, and consistency from beginning to end. He can see the entire context of the existence of that thing.
What about when he looks at people?
When the Buddha looks at a person, he can see those same suchnesses, the 3 contexts of existence, which are self, other, and environment, and he can see the entirety of their karmic past, present, and future.
What gives him such superior sight and knowledge?
It is enlightenment, the Dharma, and purified senses that cause him to see.
And how might we come to see such things and people that way?
Well, I suppose we ought to become Buddhas.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week, we will be doing a deep dive on the Tiantai or Tendai school of Buddhism. What is this school? How is it different from other schools? How does it influence other schools? We hope you enjoy. So, what is Tiantai/Tendai?
Yes, so Tiantai is a school of Mahayana Buddhism that originated in China in the 6th century. The word Tiantai, whose characters I'll put into the show notes, translates to heavenly vehicle. This vehicle refers to a doctrine of the Lotus Sutra. We've not talked extensively about the Lotus Sutra yet, but we will because this sutra is perhaps one of the most popular and important in all of East Asian Buddhism. It's definitely the most copied and the most recited sutra in all of East Asia, in conjunction with the Heart Sutra, another sutra which we will do a full episode on. The school of Buddhism flourished in China under the 4th patriarch Zhi. Zhi wrote a lot of commentaries and a lot of literature about the Lotus Sutra and the teaching of the Lotus Sutra. Tiantai was brought to Japan in the 9th century by a Buddhist thinker named Saichō. Saichō was a Japanese Buddhist who went to China to see what was developing in Buddhism at the time, and returned with what is now called Tendai, and returned with all kinds of other doctrines that were going on in China at the same time, such as esoteric Buddhism, Chan Buddhism, which would develop into Zen Buddhism, and others. Tendai went on to become one of the dominant schools of Japanese Buddhism until the late 1500s or so. In Japan, it was heavily influenced by esoteric Buddhism, which we'll do another deep dive episode on eventually. Essentially, this means that it was influenced by concepts like the use of sacred and mysterious words and images for salvific purposes. Esoteric Buddhists rely heavily on mantra, mandala, and mudra, which we've spoken about before as being sacred words, sacred images, and sacred body poses. Tendai and esoteric Buddhism were the platforms from which Zen Buddhism, Nichiren Buddhism, and Pure Land Buddhism were all born. In fact, all of the founders of these schools of Buddhism in Japan started out as Tendai monks, and then they went on to reform Buddhism in what is now called the Kamakura period of the 12th and 13th centuries in Japan. That in itself is a very long and complicated history, but we should go on to say something about the doctrine of the Tendai school.
Before we do that, I have a slight clarification question I'd like to ask.
Of course.
So, Tiantai is Chinese and Tendai is Japanese?
That's correct. And they use the same characters and they have the same meaning, but the Japanese pronunciation is just slightly different, and there's no tones in it as well.
Gotcha. Okay, so going back to doctrine, how is Tiantai/Tendai different from other schools of Buddhism?
Where it differs the most is on the significance and function of the Lotus Sutra. In that regard, the Lotus Sutra is the main emphasis of this school. The Lotus Sutra text overturns the idea that there are 3 vehicles to nirvana. The 3 vehicles are the voice hearers, known as Shravakas or Arhats, the solitary Buddhas, known as the Pratyeka Buddhas, and the Bodhisattvas. Shravakas practice what we understand to be the Theravada path. They start out in the world, and then they renounce the world and possessions and attachments, and they go and live in a monastery, and all they own is a robe and a bowl, and they study the sutras, and they do rituals and study on their own, meditate on their own to achieve enlightenment on their own. The Pratyeka Buddhas are the weirdest group of people in all of Buddhism. There are actually no named Pratyeka Buddhas in any sutras, and so it's often argued that these Buddhas are entirely theoretical in nature. Like, because there's enough people in the world, there must be Buddhas like this. These Buddhas, they're always mentioned as being present at these different events where the Buddha is preaching, but they're never named and they're never described in any detail. The Pratyeka Buddhas are these individuals who go out into the forest and they attain enlightenment on their own without hearing the teaching, reading the texts, or anything. They simply go out into the woods, and they're said to attain enlightenment by coming to a very Buddha-like understanding of dependent origination. They penetrate how cause and effect relationships between things end up culminating into an empty of substantial existence person, meaning they understand the nature of self through watching the process of nature around them and through ruminating and considering that process in their own way. Before the Lotus Sutra, all of these three vehicles were arranged in a hierarchy, according to the Mahayana Buddhists, but ultimately they all had the same end. They all had the same nirvana at the end. But the Lotus Sutra says that these three vehicles are actually resulting in provisional enlightenment, and they are not how we are supposed to understand the path. The Lotus Sutra argues that the three vehicles are actually one vehicle, known as the Buddha vehicle. So in addition to Shravakas, Pratyeka Buddhas, and Bodhisattvas, now there is a fourth vehicle which subsumes the other three, known as the Buddha vehicle. This is often called the Ekayana, the one vehicle. This vehicle has everyone on it, everything and everyone on it. So in short, the text argues that anybody who comes in contact with the Lotus Sutra is prophesied to become a Buddha in either a very short amount of time or in a very long time. But regardless, it's everybody. Chinese Tiantai and Japanese Tendai also have this teaching called 3,000 realms in a single thought moment. This is a very esoteric teaching in nature, as you'll see whenever we discuss esoteric Buddhism in more detail. And it's very complicated and difficult, so I'll try to give the very best explanation of it that I can. In Japanese, it's called Ichinen Sanzen. Ichinen translates to one thought moment, and Sanzen is the number 3,000, referring to the 3,000 realms. This teaching is related to the interpenetration of all things. It's one of the hardest concepts in Mahayana Buddhism. We have actually spent 4 weeks in my graduate school level seminar trying to unpack it all. So let me start by explaining interpenetration to make it make sense. In the Flower Garland Sutra, or the Avatamsaka Sutra, there's a metaphor used that's called Indra's net. Many of you may be familiar with this. Indra has this net that's full of jewels, and every single jewel reflects every single other jewel on its surface. And the purpose of this metaphor is to speak to the fact that all things are related to all other things in some way. For example, any word has all other words packed into it because it's related to them by meaning, sound, or use. The word microphone is contrasted with the word computer by its meaning, by what we are using as the physical object of that word, and by its use, and by its sound, etc. And you can go on to every single word in the whole dictionary by using that line of reasoning. So, in that way, all moments are also every single moment. They are also inside every single moment. So that means that in the right now is every moment of the past, every instant of the present, and every moment of the future. Now that you have this ruminating in your mind, let's start counting the 3,000 realms that this is referring to. There are the 10 Dharma realms. These are the realms that we might be familiar with. These are the realms of rebirth. They are hell, hungry ghosts, animals, people, jealous gods, Shravakas, Pratyeka Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and Buddhas. In each of these realms, you can find individuals from all other realms. We are in the realms of humans, but within this realm, of course, we can find animals, we can find bodhisattvas, etc., etc. So that means that in each Dharma realm, each single one, there's 10 others. So that's how we make 100. In each of these realms are 3 contexts, you might say, or characteristics of existence. These are our personhood as constituted by the 5 aggregates, our context as living beings in community with each other, and our context of the environment we live in. In short, this is referring to self-other environment. All 3 of these things together are what make a self, according to this teaching. So it goes beyond just the 5 aggregates to include other people and to include the space that you are in. Now, in each of these 3 realms, there are also 10 factors or 10 states. These are the 10 suchnesses that we talked about in the beginning of the episode. These are appearance, nature, entity, power, influence, internal cause, relation, latent effect, manifest effect, and consistency from beginning to end. These 10 suchnesses give you context to the entire trajectory of the existence of a thing, or I guess you might say the arising of a thing. Through all these 10 things, you can understand the past, present, and future, and provisional nature of something according to how it arises in the world due to cause and effect and emptiness and the effect it has on the world. Through serious contemplation, you can come to figure out these 10 suchnesses about anything in the world. It just takes a lot of meditation and a lot of study and a lot of practice. But all of these add up to the 3,000 realms. So previously you would think, I'm very lucky if I can study and work to have this experience of understanding these 3,000 realms at one time, even once in my life. This teaching in the Lotus Sutra and in the Tiantai and Tendai tradition argues that these 3,000 realms are in every single thought and moment. So that means that they're present and interpenetrative and coextensive with every single sentient conscious moment that we have as individuals. As you can see, this is very complicated stuff. I'll include a visual representation of this idea in the show notes to make it make a little bit more sense, but the visual representation looks kind of like a fractal. You can keep going and going and going and going, smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and it all looks the same. And this is their grand diagnosis for the whole nature of reality and its relationship to the individual in reality, or the individuals, plural, in reality.
So if I were to spend time to ask every question that arises from that explanation, we'll be here for approximately 4 weeks, given how long it took you to do it. So we're going to have to leave some of that as we'll get back to that later. But one question I have is, what are the Tiantai followers actually doing in relation to this teaching? Are they meditating to understand all of these 3,000 realms at once?
Yeah, that's a good question. This is a question that applies beyond even just Tiantai. So a lot of times Buddhist schools will have a doctrine, and that doctrine will be very special and unique to that school as compared to other schools. And a lot of times, though they have it, they may or may not do anything with it. So if you go and look at a Tiantai or a Tendai temple and figure out what they are doing, there is meditation practice. There is contemplation practice. There is this goal of being able to live in an experience where you comprehend all of the 3,000 realms in a single thought moment. That is what they believe is what the mind of a Buddha works like. As you can see, there's very little difference between an experience of Ichinen Sanzen, or 3,000 realms in a single thought moment, and omniscience, like straight, pure omniscience. And that's related to the doctrine of enlightenment. Enlightenment is always thought of as attaining omniscience through practice and meditation. So they are striving towards that. That's definitely the goal. But what takes up actually the vast majority of their time is copying and reciting the Lotus Sutra. So rather than trying to skip to the end, I guess, what they're trying to do is accrue enough merit and accrue enough knowledge through study and recitation to hopefully be reborn as a character who can experience Ichinen Sanzen more quickly or more easily or better than they can as human beings now. And that's related to the fact that, as you can see, this is a very difficult experience to have. Imagine if in every single sentient moment of your life, you were cognizant of literally all of reality. And you can see how this is the end goal, but it's very far away. It's something that they believe we are all destined to get to, but certainly something that is not easy to get to, and something that takes a lot of time and study, more study and time than one lifetime affords a person. And additionally, to make it even harder, we have karma holding us back. So certainly we have good enough karma to encounter the teaching. You have to have a certain amount of good karma in your past to encounter the Lotus Sutra or to encounter this teaching. So congratulations to all of our listeners, because you guys have lived meritorious lives and therefore have come into contact with this. And according to this teaching, you're destined to become a Buddha now. But either way, this is something that you're being held back, so to speak. It's like you can think of karma as baggage that prevents you. You have to let go of the baggage, or else it'll prevent you from climbing to the summit of karma, where then you can finally stop climbing and become a Buddha, if that makes sense. So they're trying to do the simpler, easier practices and the simpler, easier rituals. And they're also trying to propagate the Lotus Sutra in society. So they are trying to spread the teaching of the Lotus to everybody. They're not just trying for themselves. They're trying to also still do Mahayana Bodhisattva stuff, because that's still emphasized here.
Okay. So how long is the Lotus Sutra? Is this one of the ones that you mentioned that's really long?
Yes, it is about 300 pages translated in English.
Gotcha. Okay. So when you were talking about studying, copying the Lotus Sutra, like that's trying to memorize a 300-page book, basically. So yeah, okay, I can see how that would take up the majority of one's time.
Exactly. And oftentimes, like, there are certain ones that are recited and copied more than others because they have like a particularly incisive teaching. So chapters like 2 and 16 and 12 and 25, all of which we will read and discuss separately throughout the course of the podcast, they are recited and copied the most because they relate to very important teachings. In addition to this Ichinen Sanzen, there's also the teaching that even the most evil character, even the most evil person can still become a Buddha, which overturns the teaching of the Echantaka, which we've encountered before, which is this character who cannot and will not ever become enlightened, much less become a Buddha. Additionally, it also brings in the teaching of skillful means or expedient means, in Sanskrit known as upaya, as we've talked about before. That is highly emphasized, that the Buddha, through creating causes and conditions and through parable and simile and metaphor, enlightens people not by giving it to them directly, but by giving them kind of an understanding or a foundation through which they can realize their own understanding. So there's a lot of parables and a lot of stories in the Lotus Sutra, a lot of famous ones. For example, the parable of the burning house, Phantom City, the parable of medicinal herbs. There's lots of them. And all of them are related to a particular component or a particular facet of the teaching. And they're all meant to demonstrate through simile and parable all of these different components of the teaching. And the most important and most complicated and most controversial teaching of the Lotus Sutra is also the fact that it says that the Buddha, the Shakyamuni Buddha, who our historical Buddha, he's actually the infinite or primordial Buddha who has an immeasurable lifespan. This is something that really overturns everything up to that point. The idea was that the Buddha has had infinite rebirths and everything, but in those rebirths, he was a person, an animal, a bodhisattva, a hell dweller, whatever. He had all of these different realms that he occupied, and he accrued enough merit so that he came into the world and became a Buddha in his very last life. And then he died, and that was his final nirvana. That was the teaching before. But the Lotus Sutra says, no, all of those stories, all of those lives, all of that dying and going into my final nirvana stuff, that was all actually skillful means. And actually, I have an immeasurable lifespan. And he basically makes himself God, like analogous to the Christian God in that teaching. And what I mean by that is he says he's been enlightened since eternity, and he has been doing all of these rebirths and telling all these stories and preaching this sutra for eternity, and he never actually fully died, and that in that regard, nirvana is not dying for the last time. So, as I'm sure that we have encountered with Buddhism, the teaching used to be like nirvana is your very last rebirth. After you reach nirvana and pass off, you are no longer in the realm of samsara. You've broken the cycle of birth and death, and then you don't come back. But the Lotus Sutra says you do, because the Buddha keeps coming back. And he argues that all Buddhas keep coming back. So it's a very controversial text, and a lot of schools don't even actually regard it as being part of the canon. They actually completely reject it on the basis of the Buddha being eternal and going against the teaching of emptiness and impermanence.
We should probably do some episodes on the Lotus Sutra soon. It seems like it's really too important to not examine at this point.
I agree.
So, how does Tiantai/Tendai Buddhism affect or influence other schools of Buddhism?
As I've mentioned, Zen, Nichiren, and Pure Land Buddhism were all born out of Tendai. In that regard, all of those schools are responding to or expounding on Tendai philosophy and practice. So all of these schools have a very particular relationship with the teaching of the Lotus Sutra, and they have a particular relationship with Ichinen Sanzen. The Zen patriarch Dogen and Asai, Dogen being the patriarch of Soto Zen, and Asai being the patriarch of Denzai Zen, they each have commentaries on the Lotus Sutra that try and make sense of it in terms of their own Zen Buddhist philosophy. Nichiren is a very, very important and divisive character in Japanese history because he takes the Lotus Sutra at really face value and is also influenced by all of this Tendai Ichinen Sanzen doctrine. And he becomes a very strong critic against the Japanese government. I really can't say government. I really should say the Japanese imperial line at the time for not accepting the Lotus Sutra and making it be the state religion of Japan before Japan was even a state. He's actually imprisoned and exiled and almost executed, and he becomes a Lotus Sutra radical, if you might think of one. And then the patriarchs of Pure Land, known as Honen and Shenran, they all also have a particular relationship with the Lotus Sutra. And most of their relationships hinge on what they think of as being the primordial Buddha. It's very ambiguous in the text itself, as we'll see when we read it and discuss it. And the Zen Buddhists think that it's the physical body of Shakyamuni. They think that it's the physical body of the historical Buddha. Nichiren thinks that it is the immortal body of Shakyamuni. So not the body that we see and touch and have sutras from, but actually this immortal, immeasurable lifespan Buddha who manifests in the world as Shakyamuni. And then the Pure Land people think that that primordial Buddha is Amida, who is another Buddha that saves individuals and takes them to his Pure Land, which is one step before nirvana and is a place where you're preached the Dharma by Amida himself all the time. And it's your very, very last birth. And they think of it as being easier to get to than total nirvana, and therefore being the place we want to go when we die, because Amida can take us there. So that's all of their relationships with the Lotus, and we'll talk about those in more detail later. But remember that Tendai in particular emphasizes the superiority of the Lotus Sutra over other teachings. The only school to be born out of Tendai that continues to emphasize that superiority is Nichiren Buddhism, which takes the superiority of the Lotus to extremely new heights. Out of Nichiren Buddhism, an organization that many of our listeners may be familiar with was born. That organization is Soka Gakkai. This is a Japanese new religious movement founded in the 19th century. Its birth is a complicated story of nationalism and the Asia-Pacific War, but nowadays it boasts 20 million members worldwide and is still closely related to Nichiren Buddhism, even if they did have a very politically charged split in 1999 that I won't go into right now. But Zen and Pure Land Buddhism don't emphasize the Lotus Sutra nearly to the same level as Tendai and Nichiren Buddhism. They interpret the important teachings out of the Lotus Sutra as universal Buddhahood. And Nichiren Buddhism emphasizes this as well, but not nearly to the same degree as before, and thus they expound on that teaching a lot. Each of these schools will get its own episode. Zen has already had its own episode, and will probably do more in the future, and later on, we'll discuss their relationships to each other.
All right. We hope you enjoyed this episode about Tendai Buddhism. Join us next week where we will discuss Buddhism and death. How does Buddhism deal with death? What are some of the doctrines surrounding death? How do they play out in ritual and practice? We hope to see you next time. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening. See you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Our email is bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com.
You can find us on Twitter at Bright Buddhism.
As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.